A socket wrench, 8 pounds, chrome-plated, 3/4 of an inch drive. Falling through darkness inside the most powerful weapon system the United States had ever deployed. Senior Airman David Powell watched it tumble past the work platform, past the fuel tanks holding hundreds of tons of volatile propellants, heard the metallic ping as it struck the missile skin below. His crew chief's voice crackled through the headset. "No big deal, happens all the time." What happened next would come within 90 feet of detonating a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead. 600 times more powerful than Hiroshima. In the middle of American farmland. And it all started because the maintenance manual said to hurry. This is the story of how a $3 tool nearly vaporized Arkansas. The Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile stood 103 feet tall in its silo. Launch Complex 374-7, officially. To the 53 airmen of the 381st Strategic Missile Wing who maintained it, the site was simply Damascus. One of 18 Titan II installations ringing Little Rock, forming America's most powerful nuclear deterrent during the Cold War. Each missile carried a single W-53 warhead. 9 megatons. The explosive equivalent of 9 million tons of TNT. For perspective, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. This single warhead was 600 times more powerful, capable of destroying every structure within a 12-mile radius, creating a fireball 3 miles in diameter, producing lethal radiation across hundreds of square miles. But you'll see how the technology everyone called foolproof wasn't. The Damascus complex stretched 300 feet underground. The missile itself sat in a silo 155 feet deep, lined with steel and concrete walls 8 feet thick. Designed to withstand a near miss from a Soviet nuclear weapon. The launch control center sat separately, connected by a 1,500-foot underground tunnel, insulated from blast, radiation, and electromagnetic pulse. On paper, the Titan II was invincible. In reality, it was a temperamental monster that leaked, corroded, and required constant maintenance to prevent catastrophic failure. Technical Sergeant Jeffrey K. Kennedy, who served at Damascus from 1978 to 1981, later testified to Air Force investigators. Quote, "The Titan II was the most complex weapon system I ever worked on, and I worked on them for 8 years. Everything leaked. The oxidizer leaked. The fuel leaked. The hydraulics leaked. We were constantly doing what they called propellant transfer system maintenance, basically trying to keep these things from destroying themselves." The missile used Aerozine 50 as fuel, a 50-50 mixture of hydrazine and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. Highly toxic, extremely flammable. The oxidizer was nitrogen tetroxide. Equally toxic. When these two chemicals mixed, they ignited spontaneously on contact. No spark needed. This hypergolic reaction made the Titan II a reliable weapon. It also made it a bomb waiting for the wrong trigger. By September 1980, the Damascus missile had been on alert for 17 years. The silo systems were aging. Maintenance crews worked constantly to keep the bird flight ready. The Air Force had established detailed procedures for every maintenance task, compiled in technical orders that filled entire libraries. But there was a problem. The procedures took too long. Strategic Air Command needed these missiles ready to launch on 15 minutes notice. Maintenance windows were tight. Crews were under constant pressure to work faster. So they developed shortcuts, workarounds. Ways to shave hours off procedures that the technical manuals said required days. Senior Airman David Powell and his partner, Airman First Class Jeffrey Plum, were performing what the Air Force called a routine propellant transfer system check. This involved entering the silo, accessing the missile's fuel tank pressure monitoring system, and replacing a pressure sensor. Simple in concept, incredibly dangerous in execution. The technical manual specified using a torque wrench with a socket attached by a retaining pin. The pin prevented the socket from falling if it came loose. It also made the tool awkward to use in the cramped spaces around the missile. Airmen had learned they could work faster using a ratchet wrench without the retaining pin. You see where this is going. Powell and Plum entered the silo at 6:30 p.m. on September 18. They descended the metal ladder running down the silo wall, past level after level, into the confined space where America's nuclear deterrent sat waiting. The missile loomed beside them. 103 feet of aluminum skin stretched over fuel tanks containing hundreds of tons of propellants. At the bottom, they accessed a work platform beside the missile's lower section. Powell positioned himself above the pressure sensor assembly. He fitted the socket onto the retaining bolt. Applied pressure. The bolt was torqued tight. He applied more force. The socket slipped. It fell from his hand, tumbled past the platform, and struck the missile skin 70 feet below. Powell's voice came over the intercom circuit, heard by everyone monitoring the maintenance operation from the control center. Quote, "I dropped the socket. It hit the missile." Airman First Class Jeffrey Plum, working beside Powell, later testified. Quote, "We heard it hit. Kind of a metallic clink. Then nothing. The crew chief asked if the missile was damaged. Dave shined his flashlight down but couldn't see anything from our position. The crew chief said probably no damage, those things bounce off all the time, finish the job and we'll inspect on the way out." They continued working. At 6:45 p.m., the site's alarm panels lit up. Vapor detectors throughout the silo registered oxidizer fumes. Nitrogen tetroxide. The socket wrench had punctured the missile's skin, creating a small hole in the oxidizer tank. The extremely corrosive chemical was now leaking into the silo at an unknown rate. Senior Airman Powell and Airman Plum evacuated immediately, climbing the ladder to the surface. As they emerged, they could smell the oxidizer. A sharp, acrid odor that burned the nostrils. The vapor detectors showed concentrations increasing. Captain Steve Tanner, the Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander on duty that night, immediately declared a 1.alpha emergency. Propellant leak, no fire. He notified 2nd Air Force Headquarters at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. They notified Strategic Air Command Headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Within 15 minutes, flag officers at the Pentagon were reading situation reports from Damascus, Arkansas. The leak was small, perhaps a pinhole, but nitrogen tetroxide is one of the most corrosive substances ever used in a weapons system. It reacts with aluminum. The missile's skin was aluminum. The oxidizer was literally eating its way through the missile's structure, enlarging the hole, accelerating the leak. And 8 feet away sat the fuel tank, full of Aerozine 50. Colonel Robert Moser, commander of the 381st Strategic Missile Wing, arrived at the Damascus site at 7:30 p.m. He established a forward command post in the Launch Control Center, 1,500 feet from the silo. Communications lines connected him to the Tactical Air Command command post at Little Rock Air Force Base, to 2nd Air Force Headquarters, to Strategic Air Command, to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was the warhead safe? The W-53 thermonuclear warhead sat atop the missile, housed in a re-entry vehicle designed to survive the heat and stress of atmospheric re-entry during an attack on the Soviet Union. It contained multiple safety systems, fail-safe mechanisms, permissive action links that required coded signals to arm the weapon. But it also contained chemical explosives. Conventional high explosives arranged around the nuclear core, designed to compress the plutonium pit and initiate the fusion reaction. If the missile exploded, if the fuel and oxidizer mixed and detonated, those conventional explosives might detonate. The warhead wouldn't create a nuclear explosion without the proper arming sequence. But it could create what nuclear weapons designers called a one-point safety event. The conventional explosives detonating asymmetrically, possibly creating a fizzle yield. A partial nuclear reaction, maybe a few tons of nuclear yield instead of 9 megatons. Maybe. Nobody knew for certain because nobody had ever tested it. The only way to find out was to blow up a Titan II missile with an armed warhead and see what happened. Nobody wanted to run that experiment in Arkansas. Subscribe if you want more stories where institutional arrogance met catastrophic reality. Colonel Moser ordered the site evacuated except for essential personnel. The 53 airmen of the Damascus crew dispersed to designated safe areas. But essential personnel remained: missile technicians, propellant systems specialists, security police, officers monitoring the warhead status. By 8 p.m., vapor detectors showed oxidizer concentrations at 200 parts per million in the silo. The Air Force's exposure limit was 5 parts per million for an 8-hour shift. Anyone entering the silo would be breathing nitrogen tetroxide at 40 times the maximum safe concentration. The conversations between Damascus and higher headquarters reveal the bureaucratic paralysis that gripped the Air Force that night. From Strategic Air Command transcript, 2000 hours. Damascus Forward Command Post to 2nd Air Force. We have increasing oxidizer vapor concentrations. Recommend immediate warhead removal. Over. 2nd Air Force to Damascus. Negative on warhead removal at this time. Oxidizer vapors make silo entry too hazardous. We're evaluating options. Stand by. Over. Damascus to 2nd Air Force. Sir, the leak is increasing. We've got maybe 6 to 8 hours before we reach critical concentrations. If the leak accelerates, we could have fuel oxidizer contact. That means detonation. Over. 2nd Air Force to Damascus. Understood. Higher headquarters is working the problem. Stand by. Out. Working the problem meant something very specific in Air Force terminology. It meant committees, meetings, chains of command, requests for technical data flowing up channels while decisions flowed down. And while the bureaucracy worked the problem, the oxidizer continued leaking. But you'll see how the warnings from the men at Damascus were ignored until it was too late. Staff Sergeant Ronald Wayne Fuller, a propellant transfer system specialist with 8 years' experience on Titan II missiles, was at home in Jacksonville, Arkansas when he received a call at 8:30 p.m. Report to Damascus immediately. Propellant leak emergency. Fuller arrived at 9 p.m. He met with Colonel Moser and reviewed the situation. The leak was definitely from the oxidizer tank. Vapor concentrations were increasing. The missile was unstable. Fuller recommended immediate action. His written statement to Air Force investigators includes this. Quote, I told Colonel Moser that we needed to either offload the propellants immediately or remove the warhead. Those were the only two safe options. Sitting around waiting for instructions from people who weren't on site, who didn't understand the systems, was insane. The bird was wounded. Wounded birds blow up. The offload procedure involved connecting ground equipment to the missile's fuel and oxidizer tanks, pumping the propellants into storage vessels, leaving the missile empty and safe. It was a complex operation, requiring specialized equipment and multiple personnel entering the silo. With oxidizer vapors at dangerous levels, sending people into the silo was potentially suicidal. Warhead removal was equally dangerous but faster. A team would enter the silo, disconnect the re-entry vehicle containing the warhead, use the overhead crane to lift it clear of the missile, and transport it to a safe location. This could be done in under 2 hours if everything went perfectly. Strategic Air Command wanted more information. They wanted computer models. They wanted risk assessments. They wanted committees to evaluate the committee's evaluations. Meanwhile, at 10:15 p.m., the leak suddenly worsened. Senior Airman Bobby Joe Finley, monitoring the vapor detectors from the control center, logged the change. Quote, oxidizer concentrations jumped from 200 ppm to over 500 ppm in less than 10 minutes. The corrosion was accelerating. The hole was getting bigger. I reported to the command post that we were looking at maybe 2 to 3 hours before critical levels. Critical levels meant concentrations high enough to potentially ignite from static electricity or a spark. The silo's ventilation system was pulling outside air through the space, preventing explosive concentrations from forming. But the system had limits. At some point, the leak rate would exceed the ventilation capacity. At 10:45 p.m., Colonel Moser made a decision. He ordered a reconnaissance team to enter the silo, assess the damage visually, and report back. Two men, Senior Airman David Livingston and Sergeant Jeff K. Kennedy, volunteered. They donned self-contained atmospheric protective ensemble suits, SCAPE suits in Air Force terminology, fully encapsulating chemical protection suits with self-contained breathing apparatus. They entered the silo at 11 p.m. Kennedy's testimony describes what they found. Quote, "We could hear the leak before we saw it. A hissing sound, like a tire with a slow puncture, but louder. We climbed down to level 2 and shined our flashlights on the missile. The oxidizer was spraying out of a hole about the size of a dime. Red-brown vapor, nitrogen tetroxide, just pouring into the silo. The missile's aluminum skin around the hole looked like it was bubbling. The oxidizer was eating through the metal. I told Livingston we needed to get out. This thing was going to fail catastrophically. It was just a question of when." They evacuated at 11:20 p.m. and reported to Colonel Moser. The leak was worsening rapidly. The missile could fail at any time. The command decision from Strategic Air Command arrived at 11:45 p.m. Do not attempt warhead removal. Do not attempt propellant offload. Evacuate all non-essential personnel to a 3-mile radius. Wait for specialized propellant transfer system team to arrive from Little Rock Air Force Base. In other words, wait. Staff Sergeant Fuller's reaction was recorded in his statement. "I told them that was insane. We didn't need specialists from Little Rock. We had specialists right here. We knew this bird, we knew the systems, and we knew it was dying. Every hour we waited, the leak got worse. But Strategic Air Command wanted to follow the checklist. They wanted everything by the book, even though the book didn't have a chapter for this." The propellant transfer system team arrived at Damascus at 1:15 a.m. on September 19. 5 specialists with equipment to pump propellants. They conferred with Colonel Moser, reviewed the reconnaissance reports, and agreed with Fuller's assessment. The missile was failing. Action needed to be taken immediately. But Strategic Air Command still wouldn't authorize propellant offload or warhead removal. They wanted more data. Senior Master Sergeant Ronald Fuller later testified about this period to the Air Force Safety Investigation Board. Quote, "We're standing there watching vapor concentration readings climb. We're watching the missile destroy itself from the inside. And we're on teleconferences with colonels and generals hundreds of miles away who are telling us to wait. Wait for what? Wait until the bird explodes? That's what I asked. Nobody had an answer." By 2 a.m., oxidizer concentrations in the silo exceeded 1,000 parts per million. The ventilation system was barely keeping pace with the leak. The missile's aluminum skin around the puncture showed visible corrosion. The hole had enlarged from the size of a dime to roughly the size of a quarter. The propellant transfer system team made a decision. They would attempt to stabilize the missile by injecting nitrogen into the oxidizer tank, increasing internal pressure, potentially slowing the leak. It was a desperate measure, potentially dangerous, but doing nothing guaranteed eventual catastrophe. At 2:30 a.m., 2 members of the team, Staff Sergeant Ronald Fuller and Senior Airman Bobby Weiser, entered the silo. They wore SCAPE suits and carried equipment to access the missile's pressurization system. They descended to level 3, approximately 40 feet below ground. From there, they could access the oxidizer tank's pressure control panel. The missile loomed beside them, a 100-foot-tall cylinder hissing as oxidizer sprayed from the damaged section. Fuller connected the nitrogen supply line. He opened the valve slowly, watching the pressure gauges. The internal tank pressure began to rise. 100 psi, 150 psi, 200 psi. The hissing changed pitch. The leak was slowing. Fuller's voice came over the communications circuit, relief evident. It's working. The leak rate is decreasing. The nitrogen's displacing the oxidizer, creating back pressure. Give me 5 more minutes and I think we can stabilize this. At 2:54 a.m., September 19, 1980, the missile exploded. You'll see how decades of ignored warnings and rushed maintenance culminated in one moment. The oxidizer had been leaking for over 8 hours. The corrosive chemical had eaten through the missile's aluminum skin, through internal structure, through the bulkhead separating the oxidizer tank from the fuel tank. At 2:54 a.m., nitrogen tetroxide met aerosine 50. Hypergolic ignition. Staff Sergeant Fuller and Airman Weiser were still inside the silo. The explosion began at the missile's midsection. Fuel and oxidizer mixing, igniting, creating a deflagration that raced through the missile's internal structure in microseconds. The aluminum skin ruptured. Hundreds of tons of propellants detonated. The blast wave traveled up and down the silo simultaneously. The explosion pressure peaked at over 7,000 pounds per square inch. The reinforced concrete walls, designed to withstand nuclear near misses, shattered. The 740-ton steel and concrete blast door covering the silo, 3 feet thick and held in place by massive hydraulic locks, was torn from its mountings and thrown 750 feet through the air. It weighed as much as 400 automobiles and it flew through the night sky like a frisbee. The missile itself, 103 feet tall, 75 tons empty, was launched from the silo by the explosion. The lower section disintegrated, fuel and oxidizer tanks rupturing and adding their energy to the blast. The upper section, including the re-entry vehicle containing the W-53 warhead, was thrown clear of the fireball. It traveled in a ballistic arc. Apogee approximately 600 feet. Landed in a field 800 feet northwest of the silo. The 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead survived the explosion, the launch, the flight, and the impact. It did not detonate. Staff Sergeant Ronald Fuller was killed instantly by the explosion. His body was recovered 3 days later from debris at the silo bottom. Senior Airman Bobby Weiser survived the initial blast but was severely injured. He was thrown against the silo wall by the pressure wave, suffering massive internal injuries, fractures throughout his body, severe burns from burning propellant. Rescue teams found him unconscious at 3:20 a.m. He was evacuated by helicopter to University Hospital in Little Rock. He remained in critical condition for 6 days before succumbing to his injuries on September 25. 21 other personnel at the Damascus site were injured by the explosion. Flying debris, blast effects, exposure to toxic fumes. All survived. The fireball from the detonating propellants illuminated the night sky for miles. Residents of Damascus, the small town 2 miles from the site, were awakened by the explosion. Many thought a plane had crashed. Others feared a tornado. Nobody immediately realized that a nuclear missile had just exploded. Jerry Hildreth lived in Damascus at the time. His testimony to reporters captures the civilian experience. Quote, "I was asleep. Then the loudest sound I ever heard. The whole house shook. I thought it was an earthquake. I ran outside and saw this orange glow on the horizon, toward where the missile base was. Then we started hearing sirens. Police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, all racing toward the base. My neighbor said the Russians must be attacking. I told him no, something happened at the silo. We found out later how close we came." Van Buren County Sheriff Gus Anglin was the first law enforcement officer to reach the scene. He arrived at 3:10 a.m. to find devastation. Quote, "The silo was gone. Just a massive crater, maybe 200 feet across, filled with burning debris and smoke. The smell was terrible. Burning chemicals, toxic fumes. We could see twisted metal everywhere. And then somebody told me about the warhead. They said it was in the field. I asked if it was going to explode. Nobody knew. The Air Force established a 2-mile evacuation zone around the site. Over 1,000 residents of Damascus and the surrounding area were ordered from their homes. They were told to take essential items only and report to designated shelters. They were not told why. The warhead location became the focus of frantic activity. Colonel Moser, who had been in the Launch Control Center during the explosion, was uninjured. He established a perimeter around the impact site and ordered the area cleared. Nuclear weapons specialists from the Defense Nuclear Agency were flown in from Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico. They arrived at 6 a.m. Their initial assessment was cautious. The re-entry vehicle had impacted nose first, partially burying itself in the soft soil. The structure was intact but damaged. Stress fractures visible in the outer shell. The warhead status was unknown. Dr. William Stevens, a weapons designer who was part of the assessment team, later described the evaluation process. We had to determine if the high explosives around the plutonium core had detonated or been damaged. If they'd gone off, even partially, we'd have plutonium contamination across a wide area. If they'd been damaged by the impact, the warhead might be unstable. We used portable X-ray equipment to examine the internal structure. It took 8 hours to get images we trusted. The high explosives had not detonated. The warhead was intact, but the weapon had been subjected to forces far beyond its design limits. The re-entry vehicle was designed to survive atmospheric re-entry at orbital velocities and impact at terminal velocity. It wasn't designed to survive being blown out of a silo by a massive explosion. The decision was made to disarm the warhead in place. A specialized team from Pantex, the facility in Texas where nuclear weapons are assembled and disassembled, flew to Damascus. They arrived at 2 p.m. on September 19. For the next 12 hours, in a field in Arkansas, wearing protective suits, they carefully removed the warhead from the damaged re-entry vehicle. Captain Bruce Tremble, one of the weapons disposal specialists, described the process years later in a declassified interview. It was the most frightened I've ever been. We're taking apart a 9-megaton bomb that's been blown up and thrown through the air. Every connection we loosened, every panel we removed, we're wondering if this is the one that triggers something. The procedures assumed you're working in a clean facility with proper equipment. We're in a field with portable tools. But we got it done. By midnight, the warhead was in a transport container and on its way to Pantex. The civilian population of Damascus remained evacuated until September 21. They returned to find their town transformed into a military zone. Air Force security police at checkpoints. Decontamination teams in protective suits. Heavy equipment removing radioactive soil from the impact area. The soil removal was precautionary. Analysis showed no significant plutonium contamination. The warhead had remained sealed. But the Air Force removed approximately 400 cubic yards of soil from the impact crater and transported it to Nevada test site for disposal. The silo itself was a total loss. The explosion had destroyed every system. The concrete walls were rubble. The internal levels had collapsed into the crater. Debris field extended over 10 acres. It took 3 months just to clear the site enough for detailed examination. The Air Force established an accident investigation board immediately. Led by Brigadier General Richard Burpee from Strategic Air Command, the board had a mandate to determine the cause of the explosion and make recommendations to prevent recurrence. Their final report, delivered in March 1981, was scathing. From the executive summary, the Damascus accident resulted from inadequate procedures, insufficient training, and systematic failure to enforce technical manual requirements. The use of non-approved tools and techniques was widespread and tolerated at all levels of command. The propellant transfer system maintenance procedures were known to be deficient but were not corrected due to operational pressure to maintain alert rates. The report identified multiple failures. The socket wrench used by Airman Powell was not equipped with the required retaining pin. This violated technical manual requirements. But the investigation found that nearly every maintenance team used similar improvised tools because the approved tools were too slow. The decision to continue working after the socket was dropped violated safety procedures. But the investigation found pressure from commanders to minimize downtime encouraged crews to take risks. The 8-hour delay between the leak's discovery and the explosion was characterized as, quote, a systematic failure of command decision-making, with higher headquarters overriding on-scene expertise due to excessive caution and desire to avoid responsibility. In other words, the people who understood the danger weren't allowed to act, while the people making decisions didn't understand the danger. 22 recommendations were made to prevent recurrence. Improved tools, better procedures, enhanced training, reduced operational pressure. None of it mattered. In November 1982, President Reagan announced that all Titan II missiles would be retired by 1987. The Damascus accident had demonstrated what weapons experts had argued for years. The Titan II was obsolete, dangerous, and should never have remained operational as long as it did. By 1987, all 54 Titan II missiles were deactivated. The silos were either destroyed or converted to other uses. Damascus Launch Complex 374-7 was buried. The crater filled with rock and soil. The land returned to the government. Today, nothing marks the spot where a nuclear missile exploded except a memorial stone placed by the Damascus Museum. The inscription reads, "In memory of Senior Airman David Powell and Staff Sergeant Ronald Fuller." It doesn't mention how close they came. Subscribe for more stories where cost-cutting measures met catastrophic consequences. The broader implications of Damascus remain relevant today. The accident demonstrated that complex technological systems have failure modes that cannot be fully anticipated. The Titan II had been in service for 2 decades. Thousands of maintenance operations had been performed successfully. Then one drop tool created a cascade failure that nearly caused a nuclear detonation. The accident also revealed how institutional pressure can override safety. The crews at Damascus knew the missile was dangerous. They knew the procedures needed to be followed precisely. But they also knew that following procedures exactly meant lower alert rates, which meant pressure from commanders, which meant career consequences. So they cut corners. Everyone cut corners. Until one corner led to catastrophe. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger addressed Congress about Damascus in October 1980. His statement included this assessment: the Damascus accident revealed systemic problems in how we maintain strategic weapons. The pressure to maintain high alert rates created an environment where safety became secondary to operational readiness. This is unacceptable. We have directed a comprehensive review of all nuclear weapons maintenance procedures across the entire arsenal. That comprehensive review led to significant changes. New procedures for nuclear weapons handling, enhanced safety equipment, better training, most importantly, a cultural shift that made it acceptable to stop work if safety was compromised, regardless of operational pressure. But these changes came too late for Damascus. The final cost assessment of the accident provides perspective. The missile itself, $42 million. The silo and associated infrastructure, $68 million. Environmental cleanup and site restoration, $18 million. Litigation from civilian claims for property damage and medical issues, $12 million. Total direct costs, $140 million. In 1980 dollars. That's approximately $450 million in today's currency. For a dropped socket wrench. The human cost was worse. 2 men dead, 21 injured, an entire community traumatized, and a legacy of what if that haunts everyone involved to this day. The question of what would have happened if the warhead had detonated has been debated by nuclear weapons experts for decades. The consensus is that a full nuclear yield was impossible without the proper arming sequence. But a fissile yield, perhaps 1 to 5 tons of nuclear explosive force, was possible if the conventional explosives had detonated. Dr. Theodore Taylor, a nuclear weapons designer who worked on the W-53 warhead, addressed this in testimony to Congress. If the high explosives had gone off, you would have had plutonium dispersal over a significant area. Not a nuclear explosion in the thermonuclear sense, but potentially tons of yield from a fission reaction. And even without yield, the plutonium contamination would have made hundreds of square miles uninhabitable. Damascus, the town, would have ceased to exist. Little Rock might have required evacuation. You're talking about an area the size of Rhode Island potentially contaminated with weapons-grade plutonium. The warhead landed 800 feet from the silo. The town of Damascus was 2 miles away. The city of Little Rock, with a metropolitan population of 400,000, was 50 miles away. The prevailing winds on September 19, 1980 were from the south-southwest, directly toward Little Rock. Jeffrey Plum, who was Airman Powell's partner on the maintenance crew, left the Air Force in 1982. He gave an interview to the Arkansas Gazette in 1990, 10 years after the accident. "I think about it every day. What if I'd been holding the wrench instead of Dave? What if we'd waited one more day to do the maintenance? What if the leak had been faster and the bird had blown while we were still inside? What if the warhead had gone off?" These questions don't have answers. They just circle around in your head forever. Dave died because we were in a hurry. Because the system said hurry. Because operational readiness mattered more than following the technical manual. He died because a $3 socket wasn't properly secured. That's what I can't get past. $3. The Damascus Museum, located in the small town that gave the missile site its name, maintains an exhibit about the accident. Photographs of the crater, pieces of debris recovered from the site, a timeline of events, and a letter from a resident who was evacuated that night. The letter, from Martha Webb, who was 72 years old at the time, describes the experience. Quote, "They came to our door at 4 in the morning. Police officers in protective suits. They said there'd been an accident at the base. We needed to leave immediately. Take only what you can carry. No explanation. We didn't know if we'd ever come home. My husband asked if it was safe, if there was radiation. The officer said he didn't know. Just go. We spent 3 days at the shelter in Russellville. 3 days not knowing if our home was contaminated, if our town was gone. When they finally let us return, I drove past the base. You could see the crater from the road. I realized then how close we'd come to dying. How close Arkansas came to becoming a nuclear wasteland. Because someone dropped a tool." The accident's impact extended beyond Arkansas. Every Titan II site in the country underwent immediate safety inspections. 37 deficiencies were found across the entire complex, ranging from improper tools to inadequate procedures to insufficient training. Colonel Robert Moser, the wing commander who had been on site during the explosion, retired from the Air Force in 1983. He declined interview requests for years. In 1995, he agreed to speak with Air Force historians for an oral history project. His assessment of Damascus was blunt. "We were operating a weapons system that should have been retired a decade earlier. Everyone knew it. The missiles were old. The procedures were inadequate. The equipment was obsolete. But we kept them operational because that's what Strategic Air Command wanted. High alert rates, maximum readiness. And when you prioritize readiness over safety, eventually you get Damascus. I lost 2 men that night. Good men. They died because the system failed them. I failed them. We all failed them." The Damascus accident directly influenced the design of modern nuclear weapons systems. Current intercontinental ballistic missiles, like the Minuteman III, use solid propellants that don't leak and can't accidentally mix. The storage systems are simpler. The maintenance requirements are reduced. The probability of a Damascus-type accident is orders of magnitude lower. But the fundamental lesson remains relevant. Complex systems fail. Procedures exist for reasons. Shortcuts have consequences. And when you're dealing with weapons that can vaporize cities, there's no such thing as a minor mistake. A dropped socket wrench. $3 at the hardware store. It punctured a missile, started a leak, killed 2 men, nearly detonated a nuclear warhead, almost contaminated half of Arkansas with plutonium, changed how America maintains its nuclear arsenal. The socket wrench itself was never recovered. It's somewhere in the rubble at the bottom of the Damascus crater, buried under tons of rock and soil. A $3 tool that nearly cost everything. That's what happens when Foolproof meets human reality. If you want more stories of institutional arrogance meeting catastrophic failure, make sure you're subscribed. Because history is full of moments when someone said it can't happen here. Right before it happened. The Damascus Titan II missile explosion stands as a monument to the dangers of complacency, the cost of rushing, and the terrifying fragility of the systems we trust to keep us safe. 2 men died that night in Arkansas. A town was evacuated, a nuclear warhead was thrown through the air, and America learned what foolproof really means. It means nothing fails until it does.